Welcome back to This Week in Racing. We've got a huge portion of stuff to talk about. Sports cars, IndyCars, NASCAR, pretty much everything under the sun and all in the United States, including F1. We're going to be talking a lot about the Miami Formula One Grand Prix that's potentially happening in 2021. But first, let's get to some of the silly season news that has taken place in the past week. Fairly shockingly, JTG Daugherty Racing has signed Ricky Stenhouse Jr. for the 2020 NASCAR Cup Series season. This choice was made with Stenhouse taking the seat over Daniel Hemrick, who we speculated on this show would take that seat, but no, the former Roush Racing driver is going to be in that seat for next season. International Speedway Corporation, aka ISC, and NASCAR made their merger official this week, and this could have major implications for the sport going forward, particularly in the realm of NASCAR, and particularly when talking about what tracks make it onto the schedule and what tracks do not make it onto the schedule going forward. And with the persistent rumors that NASCAR may be after buying SMI, which is owned by Bruton Smith, there could be some serious implications for the entire industry going forward, as the majority of the racetracks in the country that are capable of holding major events will be under one banner, and that banner being NASCAR. Adam Stern is reporting that Geico may very well be the first new premier partner in NASCAR's new sponsorship model. Now, for those of you not up to date, NASCAR will not have a title sponsor for their Premier Series, aka the Cup Series, starting next year. It will be replaced by a tiered system similar to Formula One, where you see Heineken or Santander or some of the bigger sponsors across the board sponsoring races with title sponsorships and also having logos seen throughout the racetrack. That is what NASCAR is going forward with, and again, it looks like Geico is going to be the first of those sponsors to be announced. Pato O'Ward is leaving the Red Bull Development Driver Program, which he joined only a couple of months ago. He will no longer drive for the team or with the sponsorship in Super Formula. Now, the reason stated was not a performance issue or anything like that. It was simply because O'Ward was not able to generate the requisite number of super license points to make a move to Formula One. That comes from Dr. Helmut Marko, of course, the guy who runs the Red Bull development program and Red Bull Racing itself. Now, the question is, where will Pato O'Ward land? Racer Magazine is reporting that McLaren, on the IndyCar side of things, looks to be the most likely candidate to take O'Ward's talent. Now, the question, of course, that all brings up is, again, kind of the question we've been having. Where does that leave Oliver Askew? Where does that leave James Hinchcliffe? What is that two-driver lineup going to look like going forward? I think there's still question marks above both of the seats. One of the major industry moves that we discussed a couple of weeks ago was Scott Atherton leaving IMSA as the president, and his replacement has been named John Doonan, who just up until Petit Le Mans was the head of the Mazda Racing program. He will now become the president of IMSA. Now, this leaves several questions up in the air. What will this move mean for the future of IMSA? What will it mean for the future of the Mazda Racing program, particularly in IMSA sports car racing going forward? There's a lot of things I'd like to talk about here because, again, it is so significant. First of all, I'd like to talk about John Doonan himself. Now, obviously, there are a few memes out there about the Mazda Racing program, and yes, I've contributed to them in the past. But I don't think you can really hold a lot of mechanical failures against a guy like John Doonan. And looking at the success that he and Yost Racing have been able to produce this season, winning 3 races in a row, speaks to the caliber of a leader that Doonan is. The other thing to think about is just how darn passionate the guy is. I'm sure if you've ever watched an IMSA racing broadcast that you've seen John Doonan's passion for the sport. And, I was talking on Twitter with one of my buddies who's much more connected than I am, Ryan Marine. And Ryan was talking about how much credit that he doesn't get and probably does deserve by bringing Mazda, or really promoting Mazda in the grassroots. I mean, remember the advertisements that ran about probably 10 years ago now, that they always claimed that more Mazdas are road raced than any other brand on a race weekend. And I think Mazda was definitely, under John Doonan, very proud of that fact and keeping that as one of their core marketing things going forward. So what does this mean generally thinking about IMSA? Because IMSA is definitely, in my opinion, in a major state of change. And change isn't always necessarily a bad thing, but when the checkered flag flew at Petit Le Mans, there was definitely a feeling in the paddock that morning as I was kind of walking through there. I attended the event, as you can probably tell by the hat. There was definitely a feeling in my mind that there was definitely a lot of things that it was sad, because it was bittersweet, I guess I could say, more than sad. There were a lot of cars and a lot of teams that you knew weren't going to be back next year. Now, obviously, there are some cars that are just changing, like the Porsche 911 and the Corvette. Obviously, they're going from kind of louder cars to more quiet cars. In the case of Corvette, it's a pretty significant change, not only going from a front engine to a mid-engine car, but also going from a normally aspirated to a turbocharged car. And that car actually did laps, or a demo lap at Petit Le Mans, and was on display. So that's going to be quite a change for IMSA. But looking at some of the teams, I know there was talk of Magnus Racing dissolving, possibly the team owner John Potter going to another team. The number 5 Action Express Racing prototype, that seems to be gone. The number 54 Core Autosport prototype, that is gone. Lots of questions about teams going forward in IMSA, and especially when you're starting to look at down the road towards the new DPI regulations, which are going to bring hybrids, a spec hybrid unit, obviously not something that's going to be quite as development heavy as the LMP1 hybrids that we saw a few years ago and are still, of course, racing with Toyota in an effort to keep the cost down. Then there's talk about Ford. Will Ford come into the prototype ranks? Obviously, the Ford GT program, that's done for next year, and Ganassi is looking again to move all their people into IndyCar, or some of them staying in sports cars on other teams. So what does IMSA under John Doonan look like? Well, I think it's going to be somewhat similar to the way it was under Scott Atherton, especially because of kind of looking at what Mazda has done under John Doonan politically, so to speak. There's a big politics game in sports car between the ACO and the FIA, which run the World Endurance Championship, and IMSA, which of course runs the WeatherTech Sports Car Series. And if you look at Mazda, they haven't really bought in on the whole ACO, hypercar, whatever you want to call it, attitude of doing things. I think they've been pretty solid behind Daytona Prototype International. So that seems to say to me that we're not going to see a whole lot of kowtowing from IMSA under John Doonan to the ACO. Now, I could end up eating those words, but that's what it seems like to me. I would also think, because of his recent experience as a car owner, or at least someone who's involved at that corporate level, or kind of very, very closely between, working with the corporate people at Mazda and the corporate people at IMSA, he would probably know better than most people how to balance kind of the corporate side of things and also how to do business, and make sure that racing makes sense for pretty much everybody involved. Again, I think it's a really good hire. It's going to be interesting. I always overuse that word, but I think it will be interesting to see how IMSA grows, changes, and in some ways stays the same under John Doonan. But I think he's probably one of the best guys for the job in an ever-changing landscape. One more question, I guess, from this. What happens to Mazda? Now, I mentioned Ford possibly coming in with a DPI when the hybrid regulations come in. They have a very close relationship with Multimatic, who of course builds the Ford GTs. Here's my question. Can two manufacturers coexist with the same DPI chassis platform. We have not had experienced this yet. There are currently 4 chassis available to run. The Riley Multimatic, which is run by Mazda, the Orica, which is run by Acura, the Dallara, which is run by Cadillac, and the Onroc Ligier, which of course is run by Nissan, but it doesn't look like that chassis is going to be used anymore. So you would assume that if Ford's coming in, they're going to use a Multimatic. You would assume if Mazda stays, they're going to use a Multimatic. Would Mazda stay, depending on who their new their head of the program ends up being, and whether or not that person has a good enough track record, I guess, to convince the board to stay in IMSA. And then again, like I said, would Ford play nice with Mazda using the same chassis? I don't know. There's a lot of questions going forward, and as I was kind of reminded a couple of times at Road Atlanta, I'm going to try to keep up on the IMSA coverage a little bit better going forward, so expect me to cover it going forward and all of these changes. And finally, Formula One in Miami. It looks like it may well actually happen. It's planned to take place in 2021 around the Hard Rock Stadium, which of course plays host to the Miami Dolphins football team. They're projecting that this race will take place in the month of May, and yes, we're going to need to talk about that. The race is still waiting on local government approval before they can move forward and place Miami on the Formula One calendar. Okay, so Formula One in America has been always a hot topic, so to speak. The United States, I think far and away, there have been so many attempts at United States Grand Prix that there have been so many different tracks tried that the United States has contributed to a huge portion of tracks raced at in Formula One on Wikipedia. So this is the most recent attempt. And, it's funny listening to the name of the stadium, of course, where the Miami Dolphins play, the Hard Rock Stadium. I'm reminded of the Caesars Palace Grand Prix in Las Vegas and when they raced around the Dallas Cowboys Stadium, and even when CART raced around the Meadowlands in New Jersey. So, these events, these Formula One races, and Houston, another one, Reliant Park, obviously, that wasn't a Formula One race, but you get my drift. Oftentimes, these races that kind of take place around football stadiums, they don't last for very long. And parking lot racing generally, unless it's in Monte Carlo, doesn't last very long in Formula One. Can Miami itself sustain a Formula One race? I don't think they'll have any problems with crowd, but again, there's always that thing where you go, uh-oh, when you hear local government. And even Adam Stern was posting that there are already some locals who, by the way, I would say are very uneducated. It's kind of the thing that happened in Boston where they're talking about all the environment, oh dear, all this pollution that they're going to bring in. And then they drive their four-wheel drive Hummer to Disney World and ride the SkyTrain a bunch. But I digress. It's going to be tough to get it approved government-wise. I will say the one saving grace of this being in Miami at this time in history is that the Miami Dolphins really suck right now. And so, not to get too much talk into football on a racing show, but Miami, the Dolphins are so bad that they haven't really been able to generate much of a crowd. And obviously, if you're not generating a crowd, you're not generating a lot of tourism bucks. Obviously, a Formula One race is going to change that significantly if Miami can bring in an F1 race. So, tourism bucks wise, you would think that this is a slam dunk, especially international tourists coming in and saying, "Hey, a Formula One race in Miami, let's go." Talking about it from a racing perspective, the track, the track doesn't look super terrible, and that's, I guess, glowing praise nowadays for Formula One tracks. There is some of that Mickey Mouse stuff, there's no doubt about it. Very, very twisty, very, very tight in some aspects, but in other aspects, it kind of reminds me of Baku, which, let's be honest, is one of the best races, one of the best tracks on the Formula One calendar. And I think many people, before the first Azerbaijan Grand Prix, kind of thought, this race is going to suck. Why is this race on the calendar? And now you can't wait for it anymore. So there's a possibility of it being a pretty good race, all things considered, looking at it just based on the track layout. But again, historically, you look at parking lot races, they generally don't last very long. Here's the other concern that many race fans have brought up, is that they're looking at making this take place in the month of May. Now, there's a couple of concerns here. Number one, for the Formula One teams, there's a race in Canada at the beginning of June, of course, in Montreal. So you'd almost want to schedule this towards the end of May. Of course, the end of May is Monaco, so that would make things very difficult. But from a travel perspective for the teams, logically, I think you would want to stack United States Grand Prix. I guess we'll call this U.S. Grand Prix East, and then Montreal, so that the teams don't have too much extra travel to deal with. But FIA and logic usually don't go together. Looking at it from a broader motorsports perspective, the month of May is obviously huge for the two major series in the United States. IndyCar, the Indianapolis 500, say no more. And of course, Charlotte for the Coke 600 and All-Star Weekend for NASCAR. So there's a lot of stuff going on and a lot of choices for American fans to make with their entertainment dollars, especially in the month of May. Now, there's some places you could stick this on the calendar that it wouldn't butt heads too much if you're going to stick it in May. I think the first weekend in May would probably be my personal best choice, even though it would cause a little bit of issue with Montreal. The first week of May in the last 20 years or so hasn't really had a whole lot of important motorsport activities. Now, I guess Talladega, but I can't even remember if that's moved or will probably move by 2021 the way NASCAR's schedule has gone. So really, the first week of May probably be the best time to stick this because you're not conflicting with any of the activities at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and I think there's a bigger crossover between the IndyCar fans and the Formula One fans. If you don't do it in the beginning of May, boy, it will be funny if it goes up against the Indy GP, or even they get arrogant enough that they stick it against pole day and bump day for the Indy 500. Well, they couldn't do it against the Indy 500. And considering that they'll be in Monaco, it almost seems like it's either going to have to be in the first 2 weeks of May or it's going to have to be the week after Monaco. I don't know. It's tough. It's tough to think where they're going to stick this in the schedule, unless they move Monaco. That would be really good, because then you could start talking about how many Formula One drivers might want to try Indy. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. But again, the problem with Formula One and the problem with Formula One in the United States is that the track record is not very good. They're doing business with the people who run the Miami Dolphins, which doesn't particularly fill me with a whole lot of hope for this. But we'll have to see. Depending on how the scheduling works, obviously it's 2 years in advance, but I definitely could be tempted to go down to Miami in the beginning of May to watch a Grand Prix. So we'll just have to wait and see. I think that would be something that I would be very interested in covering for the channel, especially because when Austin, Texas debuted, that was, 2012. So I wasn't particularly big on YouTube at that point, and certainly Indianapolis when that happened. Let me know what you think of any of this down in the comment section below. I hope you've enjoyed this week in racing. Be sure to subscribe for more motorsport content. This has been David Land on YouTube, and I will see you in the next